Hi, everyone. I'm Elle Gunderson, a doctoral student of occupational therapy at Touro University of Nevada. Today, we're going to be talking about my capstone project, which covers maternal care. And we're going to look at it with two different models. So, one is the Psychospiritual Integration Model, which is an occupational therapy specific model. And then the other is the information processing theory, which is usually used in an educational setting, although occupational therapists do commonly use this theory. All right, let's get started. So within my capstone program, my approach has the aim of preventing the development of postpartum post-traumatic stress disorder. I will call it PP-PTSD from here on out, and this occurs following a traumatic birth. My setting is Centennial Hills Hospital, their maternity unit. My capstone program's approach is three-tiered. So we are looking at the newly delivered mothers who are giving birth and potentially having traumatic births. Then we're going to go ahead and look at maternity care nurses. And finally, the creation of resources. Each of those things are things that I am looking at in my program and addressing. All right, when we look at the psychospiritual integration model, it began in 2003. That's when it was created and published. And it was created by an occupational therapist by the name of Chris Kong, who has a PhD in divinity. He worked at the Australian university system for 20 years, and he currently works for the Asian Center for Creative Theology in Singapore. He teaches religious and contemplative studies. Within this model, occupation and spirituality, the connection between the two is that spirituality is the goal of occupation. And so you look towards the top of the schematic and you'll see that I have that highlighted, that this algorithm takes you from your social and environmental environment, and then it brings you all the way up, ultimately with the hope of ending in the spirituality or spiritual latency. Spirituality is at the core of every occupation and vice versa. So we know that within this model, we can see spiritual written several different places. We have it up higher, where it's highlighted in blue, and that's what we're focusing on right now. And we see how occupation, so occupational deprivation, dysfunction, imbalance, and justice, or conversely, abundance, function, balance, and justice, feed into either spiritual deprivation or spiritual fulfillment. And what I love about this model is that it looks at the individual and community. And as we know, the new OTPF has expanded to really take a look at wider systems outside of just the individual. Finally, spirituality has 6 dimensions. The ultimate spirituality that we want to get to. We have becoming, meaning, being, centeredness, connectedness, and transcendence. All right, so each dimension flows to the next when we're talking about that spiritual section, and it's ever expanding. So it starts out smaller, and then it gets bigger as you go further down. So within the deeper zones, there's connectedness and transcendence. But before we get there, there's the becoming. So let's think about moms here. So a lot of moms are not moms yet, right? Until they give birth. And when they give birth, they become a mom. And even if they already have children, they're becoming a new mom, right? Rather than a mom of one, a mom of two. And rather than a mom of two, a mom of three. And that does absolutely change your identity and the way you approach things. So they're becoming moms. And then there's this meaning associated with motherhood, with giving birth, with starting a new life, and how you approach that. So does this mean that you feel fulfilled? This is something you wanted your whole life, or is there this meaning that maybe this is something that was an oops and wasn't intended, and you've decided to go through with it, and you're meeting the challenge, and this meaning is really speaking to your grit and determination. So there's lots of different types of meaning that can occur around birth. And then when we look at being and centeredness, so being, who are you as a being? What are you doing? Who are you? And then that centeredness finding that balance, right, of who am I versus what's happening around me, and feeling that self connection where you feel like you know who you are, what you want, and you're at peace. And we go ahead and we move down from centeredness down to connectedness, right? So I think of centeredness as self connection. But when we go into that fifth one, that fifth dimension, it's connectedness to society, ecology, the environment around us, culture, and the cosmos. And when we talk about this cosmos, you might say the universe, or you might say God, or you might say Allah, or Yahweh. There's so many that you might say depending on your framework. Perhaps it's tied to religion, perhaps it's not for you, and there's no right or wrong. We see it. We see this model over and over again in people that have different faith traditions. So once we get to connectedness, we move on down to transcendence. And transcendence is when you achieve this ultimate you, right? To where greed and selfishness and all of these things are transcended, for the good of the world and others and the universe and all that dwell within it. And Kong really kind of looks at this as different levels, right? And that we want to get to transcendence, whether or not that's on our goals that we write down, that we have this innate drive to transcendence. It's his belief. So these deeper zones of connectedness and transcendence act to inspire, inform, and enliven. So when we reach transcendence, maybe think of like a song or a poem or something that you feel transcends this human condition. They act to inspire us. They act to inform us in our life decisions. And they act to enliven us and give us joy. So I can think back to songs throughout my teen years and into young adulthood that did all of these things for me. That when I had to make a tough decision, like maybe breaking up with a boyfriend or something, I would listen to these songs that were important to me and had meaning, that provided this transcendence for me. And I would think about what I was going to do. And it kind of helped me to get to that point. So again, spirituality doesn't need to be connected to religion. So for this model, we're going to look at childbirth as a spiritual mode of living. Your becoming, your meaning, your being, your centeredness, your connectedness, your transcendence, all of these things that we already talked about. Okay. So becoming a mother, the meaning oftentimes is continue on this link, this chain. You're a chain in this link, and you took your mother's genes and you carried them on down to your child, and your father, and so on down to your child, and not just like the physical characteristics, but how they live their lives and how you live your life and what you stand for and what your family stands for. And for meaning, really, um, it's going on to the being and being a birth mother, right? So that's what you're doing, as we talked about earlier. And for centeredness, is that loss of pretense, that connection with self that we were talking about. So, when you're giving birth, that's all you're focused on is having that baby live and giving life to that baby. And so those selfish and weird connections to the world that we kind of come up with throughout life go away, and you're stripped down to the core of who you are and the love that you have for another being. So connectedness, again, connecting to other mothers, to your new infant, to your family history, to the world, the wider world, the connection to animals who live and give birth and carry on the same traditions. And for transcendence, again, we're transcending ourselves to focus on the neonate and society at large. Within the psychospiritual integration model, there are two possible cycles that we alluded to a little bit earlier. There is the enabling, which you see in orange, and the disabling, which you see in blue. So when you follow that enabling cycle, you begin with the social and environmental harmony, right? And when you start with a disabling cycle, you begin with that social and environmental chaos. So is what's happening around us in harmony and providing peace? Or is it chaos and suffering and constant problems? Let's go ahead and look at the orange side. So the orange side was, again, that social and environmental harmony. So we know that, oh, we're going to look at actually the chaos, excuse me. So that we know that social environmental chaos leads to occupational deprivation, dysfunction, imbalance, and injustice. This is something that we talk about a lot in occupational therapy and occupational science. We talk about spiritual apartheid and all of these different ideas, but really what it's getting to, the idea is that when you have problems in your life, an environment that is chaotic, it does not add to your growth. It does not add to your growth on an occupational level or a spiritual level. Okay. And so when we have these things, it's this disabling cycle, and it leads to spiritual deprivation and absence or presence of occupational performance. So, despite spiritual deprivation, some people are able to perform occupationally for whatever reasons, right? Maybe it's personal traits, or maybe it's the level of deprivation, and so on. And so, if they are able to perform, then it goes back to that spiritual deprivation or not, and it follows a cycle. But continue on with the cycle, saying this is going to be more common, that we have a spiritual deprivation leading to the absence or presence of occupational performance. Okay, so that's impacting your generic occupation. So that's like any occupation. That's your activities of daily living, how you take care of your body. That's your instrumental activities of daily living, the chores that you do in your life, your work, your education, your social participation, your health management, on and on, right? All of those things. But then also, remember, Kong believes that there should be a separate spiritual occupation. And so he's saying that this also impacts your ability to practice spirituality, not just through occupation, but through intention, whether that's, religious services or meditation, yoga, hiking, any of those things that you derive spiritual connection through. Okay, and then we have this socio-spiritual experiments, okay? So, and then that goes down back into those occupational deprivations, dysfunctions, imbalances, injustices. Depending on where we're at, we can continue this disabling cycle on and on. Okay, now let's go look at the other side, right? Now we're on to the orange side. So we have that social and environmental harmony. And when things are going well in your life, you're able to have occupational abundance, function, balance, justice, and occupational presence of performance. So things are in alignment, right? You're really able to thrive. And that leads to the spiritual fulfillment. And when you have the spiritual fulfillment on an individual and or community level, then on an individual and or community level, we're able to get to that presence of generic occupation, spiritual occupation, socio-spiritual experiments, etc. Okay, so now we're going to go back to those top circles of the sections we just looked at. We're looking back to the blue side, and that starts with spiritual deprivation. So if we have spiritual deprivation, then we're going up to this depression of social and environmental conditions, depression of life experiences, depression of local and global conditions. And then that's going to, of course, impact to what level, if any, that we achieve spirituality. All right, and this results in the absence. Oftentimes, when we're on that blue side of that spiritual deprivation, it quite often goes to a negative outcome rather than a positive outcome. But then on the orange side, something a little bit happier, right? We're going to start with the spiritual fulfillment, whether it's the individual or community level. And really, the community level can be made up of a bunch of individuals. So if the community provides opportunity for everyone and this harmony of environment for everyone, then we're more likely to have this community ultimately transcendence, right? So just keep that in mind as we talk about this, that the way that we structure our communities doesn't just impact the individual, but it impacts the society at large. Okay, so when we have a spiritual fulfillment, it enhances our social and environmental conditions, our life experiences, our local and global conditions. And of course, that results in either the enhancements or the downward trend of each of these things. And if we're having great social environmental conditions, great life experiences, great local and global conditions, then we're more likely than not going to go higher on this 6 dimension spirituality quest, right? So you're more likely to make it to becoming. And then after enough time of this, maybe meaning and being, and so on. So psychospiritual integration model has culturally expected spiritual experiences within it, embedded within it, right? And we're going to apply giving birth and facilitating birth. And we're going to identify social and environmental chaos, diverting to the enabling cycle. Childbirth is a social and environmental harmony, right? If we look at it through harmony, then we're going to lead to occupational abundance. Spiritual occupation, spiritually fulfilling and enhancing life experiences, and ultimately reaching that spirituality, big S spirituality that we're talking about. So when I hear moms on TV or moms in real life talk about their birthing experiences, I quite often hear them talking about it in spiritual terms. That is a spiritual activity, a spiritual occupation that brought them to this level of transcendence they didn't know existed, right? They've heard about but didn't exist for them prior. I've given birth 4 times and I have had these spiritual experiences. With each birth, it's varied depending on the circumstances of the birth. My second child, I really felt as though I achieved this transcendence. With my third child, who I had traumatic birth, I feel like it was barely spiritual. And that really the spirituality was in my life for my daughter. But because of all of these other circumstances, it really hurt my social environmental conditions, my life experience. It hurts my ability to go from becoming to transcendence. And so that's something that we don't want for moms. We want them to achieve the highest level that they can. All right, we're going to shift gears now and talk about the information processing theory. And this is not the non-occupational theory that I first introduced you to. So what I love about these two models is that the psychospiritual integration model is very soft, right? It's very ethereal, very spiritual based, a lot of deeper thought, poetic even. And when we shift gears over to this information processing theory, it is very mathematical and science and data driven and how our brain works. And so I feel these two really complement one another, that the information processing theory covers the blind spots of the psychospiritual integration model and vice versa. So diving in, this was created in the 1950s by a psychologist named George Miller. He based it off of computer information systems. And just, side note there, my grandpa actually was an information systems professor in the 1950s. He was at the ground level of this study. Just a fun tidbit. This may be why I'm connected to this theory. All right, and it was also based off the cognitive theory and memory retention. So we're going to apply this to the Happy Birthday program, which aims to prevent traumatic memory retention and increase healthcare workers' retention of the memories that we want, the training that we want. Okay, so for information processing theory, the description, the theory's goal is that cognition is generalized to thoughts and behaviors. Okay, so we want those thoughts and behaviors to be positive for this mother as well as the child, but our main focus is the mother. And memory is achieved in dynamic steps. Okay, so under this theory, we believe that memory starts one part in the algorithm and then goes through several phases and then end somewhere else. Okay, and achieving ultimately long-term memory. And there are 4 steps to cognition within this theory. The 4 steps to cognition are 1, sensory inputs, 2, registration of sensory information, 3, short-term working memory, 2, long-term memory, and that kind of goes back and forth, right? It's not just one direction, and then output. Okay, so right here we can see the input of sensory information on our far left, and we can see that there are 2 feeders going in. There's internal, and then there's external. So internal is what's happening inside of us, and external is what's happening outside of us. And then once we have that sensory information, we need to make sense of it. And we first make sense of it by registering what's coming in, right? And sometimes this happens subconsciously. It's not always like in the forefront of our brain, but we register this sensory information. We taste a taste, we smell a smell, we feel the idea of where our arms are in space, right? Things like that. And within this registration of sensory information, that can either go up to executive control, metacognition, so regulation and allocation of attention to processing, planning of responses, evaluating responses and plans, regulating information processing strategies, and cognitive effort, right? And so this kind of goes back and forth between that sensory information because your body doesn't stop sensory information. It keeps coming in. So as it comes in, there's these other metacognition tools within our brain that are making sense of all of the sensory stuff that's coming in. Okay, and then when we have registration of sensory information, there can also be lost information through poor sensory registration or decay of the sensory image. So problems with sensing, or I would also add the processing of that sensing. And what's interesting about this is going to be a main focus of my project, and we'll get more into that as we go along. And as we move on from registration of sensory information, we go to short-term working memory, and that also interacts with metacognition. It interacts with long-term memory, creating long-term memories, integrating it with long-term memories. And then we also have this lost information because of decay, etc. And then the short-term working memory inputs, or it impacts our outputs, our thoughts and behaviors. And our thoughts and behaviors then create this feedback loop, going back to our input, that our thoughts and behaviors impact what kind of sensory information we experience. So if I'm thinking about how hungry I am, we have that internal sensory information that's going to say, oh my goodness, focus on how hungry you are, and I feel a rumbling in my stomach, etc. Okay, within this system, this theory, there are dynamic steps that can interrupt cognition. So traumatic memories or short-term to long-term memories can impact our memories of events. This can actually be good or it can be bad. Okay, we are going to look at this in both ways. So for mothers, we kind of want this interruption of short-term traumatic memories to long-term memories. Yet for nursing staff or other healthcare workers, we want them to have this long-term memory so they can make the best decisions possible for mom and baby. Within executive control, which we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, there's this registration of sensory information and the short-term working memory to and from long-term working memory. So I want you to think about moms, right? That if they're registering this sensory information that they're scared and they're in pain and they don't know if they're going to live or their baby's going to live, then planning of responses is going to be altered. Evaluation of plans is going to be altered. And this cognitive effort is going to be altered. So maybe there was a birth plan in place. All of a sudden, that birth plan goes out the window. We're just focusing on surviving. We're in the fight, flight, or freeze aspects of our minds, and we're not really able to focus on the connection to generations before us, our infant, or our own hopes, dreams, and goals. Okay, and then that, of course, is going to impact the way we remember the event and the way that it impacts our life. All right, so we just talked about executive control, metacognition, how it goes to and from registration of sensory information, how it goes to and from short-term working memory. As you can see, there's many arrows going back and forth, and this is because our brain does that. We don't just have information come in and go out. We have the information come in, we have other information come in, and we're trying to connect it to information that already exists within our brain. And then we're trying to integrate all of that and make new memories. Okay. And ultimately, we have this output thoughts, behaviors, and feedback about responses. And for moms, when we have maybe more negative output of thoughts and behaviors, it doesn't just stop when the child is born. It can continue on and on and on and on. So it can develop into PP-PTSD, which can be with mom for a very long time if it's not prevented or caught early. All right, and that, of course, is going to impact mom's life experience as well as baby's life experience. A lot of times we tend to focus on babies and their attachment and their growth as children into adults, which makes sense because they're innocent, helpless children. But at the same time, moms matter too. And I think a lot of times moms get lost in the shuffle. So let's think about how these thoughts, behaviors, and feedbacks interrupt mom's life and her development. All right, so for mothers within this theory, there can be this interruption of short-term to long-term memory, which we're aiming for. And for maternity care nurses, we want to facilitate the short-term to long-term memory. Information processing theory, we're looking at the sensory input. Okay, again, we have three things coming in. We have the internal information. How am I feeling? What am I thinking? How am I experiencing this? We have this external information. The room is cold, and there's a strong scent that's making me queasy. There's lots of beeping sounds, it's making me nervous, etc. And then we also have this feedback about responses. So, how is everything that we've experienced in the past and that's already rattling around in our brain, how is that impacting all of this? And as we get this internal and external information coming in and going through that whole system, it's coming back and it's going to impact the information we have coming in going forward. So, if as a mom, I feel scared, something happens, there's bright lights and loud sounds and chaos, and I'm scared, okay, that is going to impact the way I take in new information. When my baby's born, I'm probably not going to be thinking, oh my gosh, what a miracle. I made her, connection, I love her, wonderful. There's likely to be this response of, oh my gosh, is she okay? Is she going to die? I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop because I'm worried, I'm scared, I'm in fight, flight, freeze mode. Okay. So this is what we're looking at. Okay. The decay of information, the regulation and allocation of attention to processing, the evaluation of responses and plans, regulation of information processing strategies, cognitive efforts, and all of these things feed into the short-term working memory and long-term memory. Something to understand about PTSD. Well, we're still studying it. What we understand is there's a strong visuospatial cognitive element. And what that means is when you're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, you're taking in more information visually and spatially. So that's like, the things that are around you, the distance between things, than is normal. And this, of course, is because you need that information to run from a dinosaur, right? Humans never were with dinosaurs, but you get the idea, right? You're trying to run from a bear. And so you need to process everything in the environment, everything I'm seeing, and the distance from here to there, how I can get away, right? And so you have way more information than normal coming in. And you have this cognitive element where you're processing this information in real time, very quickly trying to make decisions. But what we know is that when this becomes a long-term memory, there is this disorganization because our brains, you know, we aren't used to having this much visuospatial cognitive information. And so there's this disorganization, and there's these memories that are floating around that are really damaging. and they can present themselves as nightmares, right? So you think about those night terrors that go along with PTSD and how there's this abundance of visual information that is disturbing. Okay, we see this in reliving the event. So there's people who are walking around and it's almost like a nightmare in real life. And to them, it's real and it's happening, and they're seeing things and imagining things that quite often are not there. Okay, and so we don't want this. We don't want these short-term memories, traumatic memories, turning into long-term memories that are going to affect people long-term and impact the way they live their life, the decisions they make. We don't want them stuck in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Okay. So these problems with remembering, the decay of information, we can see how that would be a problem, of course, though, for healthcare workers, right? Whether we're in a traumatic event, right? So this can be traumatic for doctors, nurses, other healthcare workers when moms have a near hit or miss with something bad that could have happened, right? And that can be traumatic for nursing staff or our physician staff as well. And we don't want them, though, while they're in real time working, to forget any of these memories, these long-term memories, as far as how to help moms. But we also don't want them to have these long-term memories of trauma either. But really what we're focusing on primarily with the trauma response in this project is mothers. Okay, so for the purposes of this, we really are looking at it saying we want nursing staff or other healthcare workers to retain this long-term information, specifically about my program and how to work with moms. And we want mothers to have this decay of information of the too much visual spatial traumatic information or memories. We don't want them forgetting the birth of their babies, right? That's not what we want. We want them to remember this wonderful experience. We just want them to remember the good things and forget a lot of the traumatic things. So these thoughts and behaviors change postpartum outcomes, as we've alluded to, their health, the baby's health, whether they go to doctor's visits. You know, if a mom has a PP-PTSD response, she might avoid every doctor office, and it might look like she's a neglectful mom. She might even avoid her baby if it reminds her of the event, and it might make her look like a neglectful mom. But this isn't something inherent to her. This is a trauma response. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's compare the psychospiritual integration model with the information processing theory. Okay, so similarities, they both have an algorithm. Okay, the context, they both look at the internal and external experiences of individuals. Both are performance based. They're looking at that output, whether it be transcendence or it just be output informing your actions. They organize factors that lead to positive and negative outcomes. They help us understand how those things occur. And then occupations can be applied to, so these can be applied to multiple occupations, right? They're not just tied to big S spirituality occupation or learning, right? They can be applied to many things. The differences. So when we're looking at the client, one, so the psychospiritual integration model is looking at the being as being primarily spiritual, whereas the information processing theory is looking at humans as being computers, right? We're literally human computers in that theory. They also have differences in the occupational goals. So one is cognition and the other is spirituality. The focus of both of these, one is more broad and one is more narrow. So the spiritual focus is more broad, and then the computer one, right, the information processing theory is more narrow. They are different in their environmental factors. So there's the sensory only in the information processing theory, and then there's all environmental factors for the psychospiritual integration model. So both can have positive and negative outcomes, right? Both of these models, they allow for this. When we look at the PSI, or the psychospiritual integration model, it can depress or enhance the social and environmental conditions, the life experiences, the local and global conditions, right? These things can depress or enhance the ultimate outcome. With the information processing theory, the IPT, and we're looking at problems with doing, with judging and monitoring, and metacognition. So when we look at these combined, PSI addresses motivation, the stakes, impact on occupation, and broader factors, whereas the IPT is addressing the mechanism of change, the connection between memory and output, and thoughts and behaviors. So when I'm using this, interestingly, the model, the PSI model, I'm using as the big picture. And for the IPT theory, I'm using as the mechanism of change, so the smaller idea. That seems a little different, right? Because when we think of theories, we usually think of them as these big, broad umbrellas, and we think of models as more focused. But the way that I'm applying them here is a little bit reversed. So if you have any questions, go ahead and email me. This information is on my website at happybirthdayprogram.com. I would be happy to answer your questions. Give me a couple of weeks to respond. And here are the references. Give you a chance to look. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you learned a little bit about these two models. Bye.